The light in the diner had not changed in 30 years. That was the thing people said about Hanover's, the breakfast spot at the edge of Route 33 in the small coal country town of Elkins, West Virginia. The same amber glow from the same overhead fixtures, the same vinyl seats, the same woman, Margaret Ostrowski, working the counter since 1979, and on the morning of March 14, 2005, the same hand-lettered sign in the window that had been there for 11 months. Have you seen Deborah? Call Sheriff Holt. Any information helps. At 6:47 that morning, Deputy Caitlin Farr walked through the door for the third time that week, ordered black coffee she wasn't going to drink, and sat down at the booth nearest the window. She pulled a manila folder from her jacket, spread its contents on the table. A photograph, a map of the Tigard Valley, a receipt from a gas station 19 miles east. She had looked at these same items 80 times. She looked at them again. What would happen in the next 18 months would change everything. Margaret Ostrowski, Deputy Farr, and this community of 11,000 believed they understood about the people they lived beside. But to understand how it ended, you have to understand how it began. And to understand how it began, you have to understand who Deborah Calloway was. Elkins sits in Randolph County, tucked into a valley where the Tigard River bends south and the mountains close in on three sides. In 2005, it was the kind of place where you could still leave your car unlocked in the church parking lot on Sunday, where the high school football game was the thing to do on Friday night, and where coal money, even fading coal money, kept a particular kind of working pride alive. Everybody knew somebody who worked the mines. Everybody knew somebody who had lost somebody to the mines. It was a community shaped by that shared reckoning, quiet and tough and loyal. Deborah Ann Calloway had lived there her whole life. She was 41 years old in the spring of 2004. She had grown up on Sycamore Road, gone to Elkins High, married young, divorced quietly, and built a life she was proud of on her own terms. She worked dispatch for the County EMS service, 10 years on the job by that spring, the kind of institutional knowledge that meant every paramedic in the county trusted her voice at 2 a.m. when everything was going wrong. Her supervisor, Jim Radley, would later describe her as the person who held the night shift together when everything else was falling apart. She had a daughter, Kylie, 17 that year, living with her in the small green house on Beach Street. She had a dog named Pepper, a black and white border collie mix, who ran the fence line of the backyard every morning like she had a schedule to keep. She had a habit of leaving yellow sticky notes on every surface in her kitchen, grocery reminders, phone numbers, little scraps of her daughter's schedule written in looping handwriting. The refrigerator looked like a map of everything she was trying to hold together. She had plans that spring. Kylie was going to finish school in a year, and Deborah had been quietly putting aside money, a little from each paycheck, in an envelope she kept in the nightstand drawer, to help with whatever came next for her daughter. College, a car, a start, whatever it turned out to be. She just wanted Kylie to have a start that she herself hadn't been given. On the evening of Thursday, April 22, 2004, Deborah Calloway finished her shift at the EMS dispatch center at 11 p.m. She signed out. She said goodnight to her colleague Brenda, who was coming on for the overnight. She walked out into a night that was cold and clear, mountain cold, the kind of cold that came back in April just to remind you it wasn't finished with you. She got into her 1999 Ford Ranger, pulled out of the county complex parking lot, and drove east on Beverly Pike toward home. She never arrived. Kylie woke at 6 the next morning, a Friday, and noticed her mother's truck was not in the driveway. She went to the kitchen. The coffee pot was cold. Pepper was sitting at the back door, which meant she hadn't been let out. Kylie tried her mother's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called her mother's work. Brenda answered. No, Deborah had left on time, just before 11. She'd seemed fine. Normal, Kylie called her grandmother. Then her mother's friend Lorraine. Then, at 8:14 a.m., she called the Randolph County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who came to the door was 32 years old and had been on the job 7 years. He took down the information, noted that Deborah was an adult, and adults sometimes made unannounced changes to their plans, and told Kylie to call back if she hadn't heard anything by evening. By noon, Deborah's Ford Ranger had been found. It was parked, not crashed, not rolled, parked on the gravel pull-off beside a maintenance road off Beverly Pike, 2,007 miles east of the Ems complex. The engine was cold. The keys were in the ignition. Her purse was on the passenger seat. Her phone was on the floor, the screen cracked, battery dead. The door was unlocked. Deborah Calloway was gone. Sheriff's deputies processed the truck. They found no blood, no sign of a struggle, nothing that clearly indicated foul play. The cracked phone screen could have happened any number of ways. Her purse being left behind could mean almost anything. The lead investigator was Sergeant Dale Holt, a 20-year veteran of the Randolph County Sheriff's Office with a gray mustache and the kind of patience that people either admired or found infuriating depending on the circumstances. He had worked 2 missing persons cases before in his career. Both had resolved quickly. One had been a teenager who'd run off with a boyfriend. One had been a man in the early stages of a mental health crisis who'd walked to a neighboring county. He understood from his first look at Deborah Calloway's truck that this was different. He organized a search the following morning. Over 300 volunteers turned out. They walked the fields and tree lines along Beverly Pike. They checked every barn and abandoned outbuilding within 4 miles of the pull-off. They called her name into the hollows. The Tygart River was checked at the accessible points downstream. Nothing. The case quickly centered on Deborah's recent life. Had there been any threats? Any trouble? Her ex-husband, Dennis Calloway, was contacted immediately. He had remarried, was living in Bridgeport, had a solid account of his whereabouts that night, dinner with his wife's family, a house full of witnesses. He cooperated fully and was eliminated within the week. There was one name that kept coming up in conversations. A man named Gerald Sproat, who had worked briefly as a contractor at the Ems complex the previous fall. Several of Deborah's co-workers described an incident in October. He had said something to her in the parking lot that made her uncomfortable enough to mention it to Radley, her supervisor. Radley had passed it along to building management. Sproat's contract had ended the following month. Natural end of the project, building management said. Sproat was interviewed twice. He denied the incident, or rather, denied that it had been what it sounded like. Said he was just making conversation, said she'd misunderstood his tone. He had no criminal record. He had an alibi for the night in question, a poker game at his brother-in-law's house in Parsons, 40 minutes away. 4 people confirmed it. Holt didn't love the alibi, but he couldn't break it. The leads dried up. The searches produced nothing. By the end of June, the active investigation had narrowed to waiting for something new to surface. Nothing did. By August, Deborah Calloway had been officially classified as a missing person, not a homicide. Missing, Kylie spent that summer at her grandmother's house, unable to return to Beach Street. She adopted Pepper. She graduated the following spring with a composure that everyone who saw it described as heartbreaking. The kind of composure that a 17-year-old should never have been asked to develop. A year passed. Then 2. By 2006, the case file on Deborah Calloway sat in a cabinet in the Randolph County Sheriff's Office, third drawer from the bottom, next to a complaint file about noise ordinances and a box of evidence from a 1998 break-in at a sporting goods store. Sergeant Holt had retired in February of that year, a fact that ate at him in ways he didn't talk about. He left his personal notes with his successor and told her to call him if anything ever moved. She did not call for a long time. The hand-lettered sign in Hanover's diner window faded. Margaret Ostrowski replaced it twice, reprinting, rehanging, keeping the face visible. The diner had a jar on the counter for the Deborah Calloway Fund, started by the women's group at the First Baptist Church, which was paying for a PI Kylie's family had hired. That fund raised $4,200 over 2 years. The private investigator, a retired state trooper named Bevins, turned up nothing that Holt hadn't already found and documented. Kylie, by 2007, was living in Morgantown. She had enrolled in the nursing program at WVU. She called the sheriff's office every 3 months, a practice she had started the day after her mother disappeared and maintained without interruption for years. The desk officer she always got to first knew her name. The Sproat lead had never fully disappeared for Holt, even in retirement. He'd written it in the margin of his notes. Alibi. 4 people. Brother-in-law's house. Confirm relationships. Check poker game regularity. Nobody had checked the poker game regularity. In the press of an active department with limited personnel, that thread had simply stayed loose. Gerald Sproat, for his part, had continued his life. He was a handyman by trade, a man who showed up in people's homes, garages, basements. He was known around 3 counties. He had a reputation for doing good work and charging fair rates. He attended the same church he had always attended. He was the kind of man that people in small communities trust instinctively because they have seen his face for 20 years. The families and neighbors of Randolph County had no reason to look at him differently than they ever had. If you believe the truth, however late, always finds its way to the light. The cases on this channel exist to prove it. Every script we produce represents weeks of research into records, court documents, and verified sources. If stories like Deborah's matter to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the ones coming next. And drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's go back to Elkins. It was the fall of 2006 when something changed, though nobody in Randolph County knew it yet. Gerald Sproat had been hired by a couple named Trotter to install a new hot water system in the basement of their home outside Beverly. While running new pipe behind the utility room drywall, the Trotter's 13-year-old daughter came downstairs to show her mother something she'd found on her phone. Sproat spoke to the girl, said something to her, in a specific way, and the girl told her mother about it that night. Her mother called her husband. Her husband called the contractor and told him not to come back. The incident was never reported to police. 2 years after that, in 2008, a woman named Rachel Fogg hired Sproat to do work at her home in Elkins. He worked at her property for 3 days. On the second day, she came home to find him in a room he hadn't been authorized to enter. He apologized. She paid him for the work done and did not rehire him. She mentioned it to a neighbor. The neighbor knew someone who had mentioned Gerald Sproat's name in the same breath as Deborah Calloway years before. That neighbor made a call. Not to the police. To Kylie. Kylie Calloway was 23 years old by then. She had finished 2 years of nursing school. She had her mother's yellow sticky note habit, little reminders plastered around her apartment in Morgantown. When she received that call, she sat on the floor of her kitchen for a long time. Then she called the Randolph County Sheriff's Office. The new investigator assigned to the case was a woman named Detective Marie Settles, a 12-year veteran who had transferred from the state police 3 years prior. She pulled the Calloway file. She read Holt's notes. She saw the margin notation, alibi, 4 people, brother-in-law's house. Confirm relationships. Check poker game regularity. She made the call that hadn't been made. She contacted the brother-in-law, a man named Tuttle, who lived in Parsons. She asked him about April 22, 2004. She asked how often those poker games happened. Tuttle said they'd played maybe 4 times total that year. He thought. Said actually, he wasn't sure Gerald had been there that night specifically. He'd been there one of those times, but he couldn't say which one. He'd been telling people Gerald was there because Gerald had asked him to. He'd been telling people that for 4 years. Settles set down the phone, pulled out a legal pad. At the top she wrote 2 words, no alibi. The investigation that followed moved carefully. Settles didn't want to tip Sproat. She went back through the original evidence, the truck, the parking area off Beverly Pike, the timeline. She requested a review of cell tower data from the night of the disappearance, data that had been obtained in 2004, but never fully analyzed. Gerald Sproat's phone had pinged a tower 1.8 miles from the pull-off where Deborah's truck was found at 11:14 p.m. On April 22, 2004, that tower was not on any reasonable route between Parsons and Sproat's home. It was not on any route that made sense unless you had stopped somewhere along Beverly Pike. Settles assembled the circumstantial case carefully over 4 months. The cell data, the false alibi, the parking area geography, the October incident at the Ems complex, the 2 incidents that had never been reported, the Trotter's account and Rachel Fogg's account, both of which she now documented for the first time. In February of 2009, nearly 5 years after Deborah Calloway vanished, Detective Settles submitted the case to the Randolph County Prosecutor's Office. The prosecutor reviewed the file. He agreed the case was strong enough to move on, strong enough to obtain a search warrant for Gerald Sproat's property. On the morning of March 3, 2009, a team of investigators arrived at Sproat's property outside Elkins. In the barn behind the house, under a concrete floor that had been poured at some point after 2004. The original permitting records showed it hadn't been there in 2003. Investigators found human remains. The identification was confirmed 11 days later. Deborah Ann Calloway had never left Randolph County. Gerald Sproat was arrested at his home on March 17, 2009, a Tuesday morning, just past 7 a.m. He was in his driveway, loading tools into his truck for a job. Investigators later described the arrest as calm, almost eerily so. He did not run. He did not shout. He looked at the officers the way a man looks when something he has been carrying for years has finally been set down. At the time of his arrest, neighbors described their reaction with words that the news coverage of that week would repeat many times. Nobody could believe it. He had been living among them for 5 years since Deborah's disappearance. He had worked in their homes. He had sat in their pews. He had waved from his driveway and spoken about the weather, and repaired their pipes, and accepted their payments, and said thank you. The prosecutor's office later stated that the concrete floor in the barn had been poured within 60 days of Deborah's disappearance. No construction permit had been pulled. Gerald Sproat had done the work himself, on a property he had owned for 15 years, and no one had asked him about it. At trial, the cell tower evidence and the dismantled alibi formed the core of the prosecution's case. Sproat's defense argued the cell data was inconclusive and the alibi witnesses had simply been confused. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Gerald Sproat was convicted of first-degree murder on October 14, 2010. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He has never spoken publicly about what he did or why. He has never acknowledged Deborah Calloway's name in any documented statement. In a final statement before sentencing, he said only, "I'm sorry for my family." Kylie Calloway was in the courtroom on sentencing day. She was 25 years old. She had completed her nursing degree by then and was working in the cardiac unit of a hospital in Charleston. She sat in the second row. She wore a yellow blouse, her mother's favorite color. She did not speak to reporters after. She did speak to a victim's advocate, who recounted for the record that Kylie had said, "I always knew she didn't just leave. I always knew. I just needed everybody else to know it too." The case of Deborah Calloway changed several things in Randolph County. The sheriff's office implemented a new protocol for reviewing alibi sources, not simply accepting a statement, but cross-referencing it against documented history. The county also added a cold case unit review process, in which any missing persons case classified as inactive would be re-reviewed every 3 years by a fresh pair of eyes. Dale Holt, the retired sergeant who had first worked the case and written that margin notation about the poker game, learned of the arrest while reading the morning paper in his kitchen. He has spoken about that morning in subsequent years. In interviews he gave reluctantly and briefly. He said, "I should have pulled that thread harder. I knew it was there. I left it for someone else to find, and it took 5 more years to find it." The Calloway case is now used in the training curriculum for new investigators at the Randolph County Sheriff's Office, specifically as an example of why alibi verification requires independent sourcing, and why a margin note is only useful if someone acts on it. Pepper, the border collie, lived to be 14. Kylie kept her until the end. Deborah Calloway was 41 years old in the spring of 2004. She had worked 10 years to be trusted at the center of an emergency dispatch network. She had a daughter she was saving money for, a little from each paycheck, in an envelope in a nightstand drawer, because that was the kind of mother she was. She had yellow sticky notes on everything. She had plans. Her name was carried for 5 years by a jar on a diner counter and a hand-lettered sign that a woman replaced twice because she believed it mattered to keep the face visible. It was carried by her daughter, who called the sheriff's office every 3 months for years from a phone in a Morgantown apartment. It was carried by a retired sergeant who left a margin note he hoped someone would read. Someone did. There are questions worth sitting with. Gerald Sproat lived among his neighbors, worked in their homes, and worshipped in their church for 5 years. What does it mean that the structures of community, trust, familiarity, reputation, can so completely conceal what a person has done? What did Detective Settles find in that margin note that made her make the call that hadn't been made? And if Kylie had stopped calling, if she had eventually, mercifully let herself stop, would the margin note ever have been read? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And tell us where in the world you're watching from. Justice found Deborah Calloway after 5 years. Not because the system worked perfectly. It didn't. Because her daughter kept calling, and a retired sergeant wrote something in the margin, and an investigator decided that a note in a margin deserved a phone call. Those are small acts. But cold cases are solved by small acts that someone refuses to let go of. If that's why you watch this channel, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More stories are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.